intro to AVS lab classes. My name is Jenny Presgrave. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there today to talk to you about aquaculture and the way that fish production relates to agriculture. So I put together a little bit of a presentation for you. Take just a few minutes to kind of give you an overview of the industry and how much it matters economically. So let's look. The total U.S. production within the fish market is about $1 billion a year. Compare this to the world market, which is 70 billion, and you'll see there are plenty of other places that rely more on fish as a protein source than we do. However, it is still the fastest growing food production sector of the world, America included. This is largely because of the fact that we are overfishing our natural fish populations, and so the agricultural side of fish, which is called aquaculture, will have to take over and make up the difference, especially as the population grows and as people in the United States are looking for healthy alternatives for other protein sources. Because fish is so high in omega fatty acids and other good things, and is in many ways a healthy alternative. So, currently half of the fish, 50%, that Americans eat is farm fish, and the other half is wild caught fish. But if you look at the chart, you'll see that it is projected as we continue to deplete our natural fish resources that farmed fish will become nearly 100% of our total fish production. So, because of this, I like to jokingly argue in ABS that we need to modify our little symbol here to include fish because it is an important part of animal agriculture. And as the populations increase and we have less and less space on which to produce a protein source, fish is the way to produce the maximum amount of protein in the smallest space. So let's start with freshwater aquaculture. Obviously, that is rearing fish in a pre-existing freshwater system, whether that is a man-made lake or a lake that exists naturally, but it is not inside, it's outside, and it's in fresh water. The three most commonly farmed freshwater fish are catfish, tilapia, and trout. I'd like to talk a little bit more about tilapia for a minute, though, because that's the species that I spend the most time studying, but also because I think it's on the rise in terms of fish production and for some really interesting reasons. So if you look at the picture I have here, one of the reasons that fish farmers love tilapia is the ratio of product to waste in this animal is amazing. So if you can see the size of the head and the tail, which are generally maybe not waste products, they're used in other ways, maybe to make animal feed and to do other things. But the fillet makes up the vast majority of the animal's body, so it's a really profitable fish. Tilapia are really good fish for aquaculture because they're very hardy. They can withstand lots of diseases that are a problem for other fish. They can survive in tanks with very low dissolved oxygen ratios. You would be amazed at some of the murky tanks you can see in which tilapia are perfectly fine. They grow incredibly fast. If you feed at maximum levels, you can go from a tiny, it's called a fry, tiny fry tilapia, to a full-grown animal ready to harvest within 6 to 8 months. So they're incredibly fast. There's really only one major downside, and that is they are pretty temperature sensitive. They're originally a tropical species, so they need decently warm water. But they can be fine in water as cool as 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. They just can't drop below that, which makes it difficult for some freshwater facilities outside in climates even like ours that can get down lower than that in the winter. They're particularly good for the environment because they can completely be herbivores, which they can thrive on really fast growing plants like duckweed Although you have to be careful with duckweed that it doesn't get out into actual ecosystems. It can kind of take over ponds. But yeah, so freshwater fish accounts for about 70% of all the aquaculture in the United States. So it's a pretty significant amount of the things that we grow here in the US. Let's look at a couple of pictures. Here is a freshwater system that's actually in South Carolina. It is a relatively small system, but with fish, you would probably be surprised at the pounds of product that can be harvested from a system this small. It functions like any other natural pond does. They have a little bit of filtration, but not much. And they, at this particular facility, just do not have tilapia in the winter. They use more temperature hardy species in the winter. This is an example of a fishery, a freshwater fishery in Mississippi, and they're harvesting from one of their external lakes. So another type of aquaculture that you see mainly in other countries, but also in certain parts of the east and west coast of the United States, is coastal aquaculture. Some people call it mariculture. Coastal aquaculture is a way of making use of the ocean, but without exposing the fish to the complete elements of deep water. You have them there, they're easy to harvest, but you get the benefits of a free water source essentially with semi-controlled conditions. Uh, Usually happens in bays, estuaries, when we talk about coastal waters, things that are somewhat protected from the weather. Um, they're easy to access. A lot of things that are grown here are, several different types of fin fish. Um, we'll talk a little bit in a minute more about the invertebrates, shrimp, and shellfish that can be grown this way. And this really helps meet consumer demand for these sea species of fish that people really, really want to eat, but that are under the worst overfishing conditions. One of the biggest places right now, if you want to see good coastal aquaculture that works well with the local economy, is actually in Hawaii. It's become a really good way for Hawaii to get jobs in that aren't tourist based. So it's a big part of Hawaii's economy. And in 2005, the United States actually passed the Coastal Aquaculture Authority Act, which is where a lot of the mandates about what you can and cannot do. Now, the main problem, I guess you want to call it that, that's happening in coastal aquaculture right now is companies are interested in introducing into their systems genetically modified fish. The first genetically modified animal that was approved for human consumption is the aqua bounty salmon, a species of a transgenomic species of salmon that a company called Aqua Bounty produced, in which they inserted genes from another fish that grows faster and grows year round. Where the salmon traditionally only put on muscle mass during the spring and summer, with this new genetically modified salmon, it grows year round. So you basically cut your grow time of salmon in half. So it's hugely popularity among salmon farmers, and it is approved by the FDA for human consumption. The issue that a lot of people are concerned with is within these systems, it would be very, very easy for an Atlantic coast salmon that is transgenomic and is in one of these systems to escape into the wider ocean. And then what is that going to do to the ecosystem itself when we introduce these new genes in places they shouldn't be? So a lot of work is being done now to produce these genetically modified fish, but to produce them such that they're sterile, which is good and bad. If you are a fish farmer, you don't have to be concerned with the fact that this animal might escape into the ecosystem, but you can't breed your own stock. That puts you at the point of buying fry from another company over and over and over again. So good and bad. But it's an interesting concept, and it's one of the major issues in coastal aquaculture currently. Another type of aquaculture, which I think looks really cool at least, is offshore aquaculture. So offshore aquaculture is essentially the same concept as coastal, except it's moved pretty far offshore. There are benefits to that. You are exposed to more weather elements, but you get less competition for space. You get deeper water, stronger current flow, which actually for some species is really important, and superior water quality. You're farther away from the runoff and things that happen close to human societies. Um, Also in 2005, the United States passed the National Offshore Aquaculture Act, which again is responsible for determining what can and cannot be done in the world's oceans in these production facilities. Um, you see here kind of some of the setup that happens in offshore aquaculture. So you have these usually geodesic, but some sort of shaped cages, in which you'll see here there are some very specific things that are not allowed in these systems because, for example, antibiotics and things like that, because obviously they run concurrently with the ocean, and so you can't just dump anything in. So that's a challenge in some ways because you need some of those things to have a healthy stock of fish. But a lot of times under these geodesic shaped cages, they have deposit feeders and things like lobster that are going to work to clean up some of the waste because usually fish are not contained this way in the ocean, so you'd end up with an overabundance of waste where you necessarily don't want it. So, in this way, you're producing another animal for product, but you're also cleaning up these guys, and then you can suspend suspension feeders. I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. And some systems even add seaweed to absorb and capture the inorganic waste. Again, you have to be careful with that though, because you don't want to introduce things that reproduce very, very quickly, like seaweed, into ecosystems where maybe they don't already exist. We don't want to choke out other species while we're doing this. Although generally aquaculture systems so far are relatively small operations, so I don't know how much of an issue that might be. All right, so invertebrates. Invertebrates can be farmed depending on the species, and either way, they can be freshwater invertebrates. There are freshwater shrimps. There are some freshwater mussels. They can be coastal. They can be farmed in a lot of different ways. A lot of times you see your shellfish, mussels, clams, oysters, because they're filter feeders. They're actually a really good thing, a really good animal to produce in small recirculation facilities, which we're going to talk about in a minute, because they keep the water clean. You can also pair them with other fish that don't keep the water clean. A lot of systems have both tilapia and shrimp because the shrimp clean up some of the tilapia waste. Actually, one oyster can filter 50 gallons of water per day, which is kind of amazing. Although it kind of makes me not want to eat oysters because if they're filtering that many impurities out of the water, how are they processing those? I'm not really sure about that. I don't really like oysters, so it's not something I have to think about. But yeah, it's one really cool story that I heard when I was in Boston recently is the scientists there estimated, and of course this is an estimate, that at their peak population, that all of the Boston Bay's water was filtered through an oyster once per week. So weekly, the oyster population in Boston filtered the entire bay. Now they estimate because populations are so low, it takes a year for the oysters that currently live in the bay to filter the bay. Um, but it's really useful thing to farm native oyster species. It takes pressure off of fishing native populations. It filters the water. And it's really, really efficient in terms of maintaining your stock because a female oyster can produce as many as 20 million offspring. So it's pretty easy to get more. Another example, these are Swedish mussels. I think it's really cool the way that they're farmed in the deep ocean in these sort of cages with these long seated columns. Um, they've been a really big part of Sweden's ability to clean up some algae blooms that they've had. because you'll notice if you look at what's happened in Lake Hartwell recently, look at other water systems that are close to agriculture, you get runoff. When you get runoff, you oftentimes end up with an algae bloom because you've thrown off the balance, the microbiological balance of a water system. So this was happening in some places in Sweden, and they started farming these mussels in mass, and it has cleaned up a lot of the problems. Plus, you get a food source in the process. All right, so overfishing. Overfishing obviously is when a species of fish is caught at a faster rate than it reproduces, and this can lead to depletion or even extinction. And you see here from the Royal Geographical Society, it's estimated that 87% of the world's fish species are at least overfished, if not completely collapsed. So we are maxing out our ability to eat fish that just happen to be part of our natural ecosystem. Um, as the human population continues to grow, we are going to have to turn more and more to aquaculture and farming fish, or we risk losing all of our marine biodiversity in the process. Um, there are some scientists doing work in Great Britain who are predicting that if we don't dial back some of our fishing levels, then we would collapse all of the world fisheries by 2050. So that's pretty big, and especially if you look at the way that other people eat on the planet compared to Americans, 1 in 5 people worldwide depend on fish as their primary source of protein. So that's pretty intense in terms of leaving them some way to continue to eat. So, what can we do? How can aquaculture help? Well, aquaculture allows us to control conditions. It allows us to heavily farm fish to make up for depleted species. Um, we can improve their diet and therefore grow them faster and bigger and get more product in a shorter period of time that produces less waste. Um, and there are some ways in which we can use it, like with the example of the Swedish mussels, to clean up other issues with water quality. All right, so the next thing I want to tell you about is sort of the last, I don't know, say 30 or 40 years in aquaculture has really focused on these recirculation systems. So instead of being out in a lake on your property, you could be in a warehouse. You could be at some sort of greenhouse or indoor facility. Clemson has one of these over in McAdams. It has a couple of different ones. But basically what recirculation does is you start off with one mass of water, and then you use technology, and then sometimes you use natural systems to continue to filter and clean that water and cycle it back to your fish. So the cool thing about recirculation aquaculture systems is how little water they actually use. They recycle 99.75% of their daily water. That means you're only losing this tiny little bit to evaporation, but you're otherwise keeping the same water mass. So if you topped it off with a little bit of water weekly, you're still using very, very little water after your initial investment of water. So if you compare it to other forms of animal agriculture or other forms of agriculture, you'll see that it is the least water intensive system to grow protein that there is. They prevent any possibility of transgenic fish from escaping. They're in a building, where they're going to go. They prevent the fish waste from being run off and into other natural systems, or any kind of antibiotics or probiotics or anything you put in the system is contained within the system. And that allows us to use some plant-based feeds like duckweed, which can be really damaging to natural systems. Like duckweed can choke a pond out of oxygen in a year. So a lot of people are hesitant to use it in their outside systems. But here's a system where that duckweed, in theory, can be completely contained. You can also trap the waste. We're going to talk about that a little bit in a minute, and use it as fertilizer. So there's nothing in the system that goes to waste. I'm not going to necessarily go through all the details of this, but essentially what you're looking at are ways to take out solid mass, the more solid parts of fish poop. You have UV filters that are going to kill bacteria that you don't want. Although the system we're going to talk about next, you have to be careful because you have good bacteria that you want. And then you have systems that are going to control the oxygen levels. And that's this sort of three-tiered system allows you to return clean water back to your fish. A lot of these have timed feeding systems so that really it's just a matter of making sure the system continues to function, and it's a low, you don't need a lot of labor to do this. You just need technicians. So another take on this idea is aquaponics, which is one of the things that I sort of specialize in. Aquaponics is the idea of using recirculating aquaculture to also grow plants. So aquaponics mimics what happens in a natural pond. If you look at a really nice, clean, healthy pond, oftentimes it's so ringed with plant life that it's difficult to get to the pond. And that plant life on the edge of the pond serves as sort of a natural filter of the water, which is why when we develop a water base like Hartwell Lake, you don't see much. Every inch of Hartwell Lake is being used for development and for homeowners and for businesses. So we've in some ways removed the natural filter. So when agricultural runoff happens, there's nothing left there to do anything about it. So aquaponics takes that system and puts it inside in a recirculation facility. So what happens, very simply, fish poop, right? Everything poops. And fish poop is primarily made of nitrite, and nitrite is poison. It's toxic to almost everything that's alive, nitrite. So when you empty some of this nitrite-filled water, and it makes it to a grow bed, you have media there. People use rocks, people use terracotta, different things. And on that media, you have nitrogen fixing bacteria. These are really cool bacteria that take that nitrate from the fish and turn it, nitrite, I'm sorry, from the fish and turn it into nitrate, which if you've been around any sort of agriculture production in your life, you will have heard of nitrate because it's fertilizer. So they manage to turn what is poison into fertilizer. And then you plant your plants, and what you have essentially is this supercharged growth system because you have constant water and you have constant fertilizer. It's really amazing how fast you can produce things on a grow bed attached to a fish tank. You sometimes have to be careful what you grow. What you see here in this little diagram are greens, lettuces, spinach. Those are really easy to grow because they can handle a high nitrogen environment. If you garden at all and you have this beautiful tomato bush that produces very few tomatoes, oftentimes it's because your nitrogen is too high for it to bloom. So people who want to grow other things other than greens have to get a little bit creative in controlling the nitrogen levels, which is possible. But a lot of us like to just grow greens. It's easy and it happens. So once these nitrogen fixing bacteria produce this fertilizer and the plants uptake it, then this water is left clean of any significant nitrogen issues. It's going to be pumped. Now this downward part of this chart is important because you have to reoxygenate that water. And one way you can do that is simply by letting it sort of drop into the next container. The bubbling and things that you see as the water falls will reoxygenate it. Now you could add a bubbler or you could add a machine that does that, but if just the act of being dropped into the next part of the system does it, then all the better. So then it gets pumped and it gets pumped back up, clean water to your fish. So within this one enclosed system, you get a protein source, you get a plant-based food source, and you get it for relatively low labor. You simply need the initial water investment, and just like other recirculation facilities, you don't have to add a lot of water every day, and you need the electric power that it takes to pump it. You may, depending on the species, need something to control its temperature. If you have tilapia, it needs to be inside, and with a heater if you live in a colder climate. But that's aquaponics, and that's how it works. And I really think it's going to become more and more an important part of food production as our human population continues to grow, because in very, very small spaces, you can produce quite a bit of food. So I'm going to give you an example. This is my house. This is my greenhouse in the back. Um, and sorry about the mess. I wasn't expecting to take pictures this weekend. These tanks are recycled tanks that are used to ship apple juice from producers to bottlers. So they can be acquired very cheaply. They're around 500 gallons each. And each of these two tanks, we have three more not pictured, but each tank can grow as many as 80 to 100 tilapia to full size. If you really wanted to densely pack them, we don't do that because we don't need that many fish to feed our family. But I can produce within a greenhouse that is approximately 20 foot by 20 foot, I can produce hundreds of tilapia every 6 to 8 months. Not only that, you see my grow beds here. We use the rock-based grow bed system. What is showing here in this bed holds approximately 60 heads of lettuce when it's fully grown out like it is right now. And these tanks support 8 beds. So when I say you can produce quite a bit of food in a small space with very little financial and electrical input, this, if I maxed out our production, would be several hundred fillets of tilapia yearly and a difficult to count number of heads of lettuce in a tiny space. So when you're looking at how are we going to produce enough to feed the world, if we can do this in a 20 by 20 square, it's a pretty efficient method with very low water input. This is the duckweed that I've mentioned a couple of times. It is one way that we feed tilapia in our system. It grows really fast. It stays floating on top of the water. The fish eat as they are hungry. We supplement with a better protein source to kind of keep our fish healthy. These are some of the guys I have in a glass tank, so you can see them. But it is efficient, and it's really, I think, interesting and cool. And if anybody wants to make the trip down to Anderson, I'll be happy to give you a more detailed tour of how to set something like this up. But I encourage you later when you have your own home and settle down. It's a really good, easy, really low labor and input way of feeding your family things that you know came from controlled conditions, but also that are done very, 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 very cheaply. Each crop of tilapia that we start, somewhere around 75 to 100, cost us about $30 as baby fry. We have maybe $10 a month in feed plus the electrical bill, and that little bit of financial input provides us with hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of food. If you have any questions about fish or aquaculture, anything I might be able to ask, please feel free to email me or to track me down in the Pool Ag building. But thank you so much for listening, and have fun at the meat lab.